You can tell them, "That must have been horrible." You can also tell them, "Thank you for sharing that with me. I'm always here for you." You can also tell them, "I'm so sorry that happened to you." You can also tell them, "How would you like me to support you? Would you like to talk about it?" You don't have to if you don't want to. You can also tell them, "Your feeling make complete sense." Another thing you can tell to them is, "It wasn't your fault." Hello, dear friends of Tubehoneza. This is Jane Uwimana. Today we are going to talk about how you can deal with a trauma survivor. There are those things you should avoid to tell to them because it can really hurt them. And there are those things you can tell them because it can really comfort them. So before we get started, I just remind you to click on the subscribe button if you have not yet done so. And feel free to share this video to your friends. Now let's get started. This world is full of people who have dealt with trauma, who are trying to recover, the trauma survivors. So it's always good to know how to talk to them because they're our friends, they're our families, and we need to comfort them. So the first thing you should avoid to tell to a trauma survivor is to ask them, how is that a big deal? That happens to everyone. Even if something is relatively common, it can still be traumatic. Something can be deeply traumatic for one person and a mild inconvenience for another. Trauma occurs when your nervous system's ability to cope gets overwhelmed. The extent of this ability to cope varies between individuals, which means that trauma is a very subjective thing. Another thing you need to avoid when you're talking to a trauma survivor is you being ungrateful. Just focus on the positive. You know, being traumatized has nothing to do with negativity, positivity, or gratitude. Especially in the early stages of recovery, a survivor might be unable to access gratitude or optimism due to the impact of the trauma. While gratitude and optimism can be great tools, shaming people for being impacted by their trauma helps no one. It's important to feel and process uncomfortable emotions instead of bypassing them with fake positivity. Pretending that things don't hurt won't make them hurt less. Another thing you need to avoid when you're talking to a trauma survivor is everything happens for a reason. If this statement gives you comfort and aligns with your worldview, that's great. But it's also important to know that claiming that everything happens for a reason can be deeply hurtful to hear as a survivor. This statement implies that there is a reason for why someone had to experience something horrible and that this horrible event was also somehow positive and necessary. It's up to the survivor to choose whether or not they want to attach meaning to their trauma. Another statement you need to avoid to tell to a trauma survivor is, "Stop being so dramatic, it's time to move on." This statement is often said in response to a trauma survivor getting triggered, and especially when the traumatic event occurred a long time ago. Trauma recovery does not follow a specific timeline, and it's not always linear. It's normal to have triggers, even if you're working hard for your recovery. When a survivor gets triggered, they're not being dramatic. They're in a deep state of internal distress. It's not about not moving on. It's about the very real impacts of trauma. There's another phrase that you should avoid when you're talking to a trauma survivor, like, "Well, why didn't you?" You see, when you start like that, this statement often turns into victim blaming, suggesting that by behaving differently, the person wouldn't have been traumatized. or that the survivor did something that somehow justifies the occurrence of the traumatic event. We can't always prevent bad things from happening. No matter what we do, blame the person who did the terrible thing, not the victim or the survivor for how they responded. The survivor did the best they could with the information they had at the time, and blaming someone for their trauma is deeply hurtful, insensitive, and inaccurate. Another thing you should avoid to tell to a trauma survivor is your trauma made you stronger. Post-traumatic growth can happen. We learn, we grow, and we may see things in a different light as we recover. However, this statement both frames the trauma as a positive thing instead of the life-shattering experience it is, and it dismisses the role of the survivor in their own growth. The survivor made themselves stronger despite the trauma. Give them credit for the work they have done. Now, there are also things you should always tell to a trauma survivor instead. You can tell them, "That must have been horrible." You can also tell them, "Thank you for sharing that with me. I'm always here for you." You can also tell them, "I'm so sorry that happened to you." You can also tell them, "How would you like me to support you? Would you like to talk about it?" You don't have to if you don't want to. You can also tell them, "Your feeling make complete sense." Another thing you can tell to them is, "It wasn't your fault." As they need your comfort, you can tell them all of those things instead of blaming them or using the phrases that really blame them. I hope that you have gained some ideas on how you can talk to a trauma survivor. So if one of your family members is a trauma survivor, or if one of your friends is a trauma survivor, I hope that from now on you can know how to talk to them in order to comfort them. Please remember to hit the subscribe button and to share this video and to share your ideas in the comment place. You can also give your suggestions. They are almost welcome. Thank you so much and see you soon for another video. Have nice times.